Hello, welcome. My name is Sky Goodden. This is a little loud. I'm the publisher of Momus, and I am delighted to introduce my editorial team, our editorial team, in the same room for the first time ever. This is Merray Gerges, Catherine Wagley, and Jessica Lynne. And we are thrilled to be here. We're thrilled to be in conversation with one another, and even better, in a public setting like this one, because we're at a pretty dynamic moment in art publishing. So there's a lot to talk about. And I'll just do some very brief kind of off-the-hip bios. Merray Gerges is one of Momus's associate editors, is an Egyptian curator, curator is maybe not a title that you associate with, critic, editor, and journalist, and is based in New York, and has worked with several leading publications in Canada, Canadian Art, C Magazine. We might talk about some of those experiences, however briefly, today. And we're thrilled that she's part of the team as of about a year ago. Catherine G. Wagley is based in Los Angeles, is a critic and an editor and writer, has her first book coming out shortly, which is thrilling, is currently with us at the expense of not being with two very little babies. So I just want to say thank you so much, especially for coming across the continent for this conversation, given that context that you're currently in. That's hugely meaningful. And is our managing editor. Jessica Lynne is associate editor of Momus, a founding editor of Arts.Black, and has published with Oxford American and Art Forum and Believer. And there are, by the way, many citations among these three that will be touched on, I imagine, in the course of conversation today, but widely read critics all, in addition to being pretty profound editors in this space. So I want to sort of set us against a small backdrop of, first of all, Momus is turning 10 this year, which I never thought would happen. Thank you. Thank you. And yet, it sort of feels like year one, because we are this team now in a way that feels genuinely collaborative and game-changing for the scope of the publication, for the depth of the work we're doing, and for the kind of reach that we're experiencing with our writers and our audience. So in a way, I'm like, year one has just taken place, not year 9. But all of which is to say, this is a huge moment for us in terms of growth, and yet this is happening against, as we know, a backdrop of pretty destabilizing changes in art publishing, and that's putting it as neutrally as I can. So I want to start us off by talking about crisis, however briefly, because that is not a word that I have typically associated much with my experience of art writing and working as a publisher, and yet it is such a motivating we sprung from a place of lack and a place of recognizing that, especially in Canada, there were certain holes that needed to be addressed in terms of slowing down, going deeper, putting in rigor, and also, trying to shore up and really support a younger, or let's say just more emerging cast of writer. And so I want to understand from our panelists here how you're seeing crisis inflect the arc, or has it only become relevant in recent, let's say, seasons, that is actually what's happening against the work that we're doing, or in the background of the work that we're doing. And maybe we can start this by talking a bit about where some of us met at Superscript in 2015. And Merray, I might just have you sort of jump in here and talk to us a bit about what that was and how it brought us perhaps to here.
Sure. So Superscript was a conference on the state of art criticism in Minneapolis in 2015, hosted by the Walker Art Center. And it was at a moment when this criticism and crisis melodrama had been playing out for, I would say, a number of years at that point. Although the conversations that were being had around the crisis and criticism were very much dictated by who the people in the room were, and more often than not, those people were white men. And so while I was in undergrad at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in the years leading in the first half of the 2010s, making a newsprint publication and very much trying to figure out how to be a critic, how to be an editor, the specter of crisis was always looming on the horizon, but also in the background. And so it was very much one that I formed myself both with and against. And felt in that moment that it was generative. But now, almost a decade later, I think that the question of what is in crisis, how, who is calling this crisis, I think is an important question to reassess, because my feeling is that right now is the first time in the history of this discourse of crisis that criticism is actually in crisis.
Yes. Yeah, I agree completely. I couldn't have said that better. And Superscript was a conference in Minneapolis that was sort of unprecedented, I think, relatively, in that it brought together, I think, over 300 critics from across North America to sit in a room for a few days and talk through some of these things, which were already at an inflection point. And that's 9 years ago, or almost 10 now. So that it could also be a place where a lot of these relationships, certainly among you and I, Merray, and as I would later discover, it was also a sort of spark for you and Jess, I think is significant, right? We don't actually find ourselves in the same room as one another often enough to be able to really sort of modulate or temper some of this framing that happens around how the field is doing. How has it been in your experience, Catherine?
Yes. Well, I am the only one on this stage that has not started a publication. And I started doing this work. I started writing criticism in 2007, which is 17 years ago now. And that was a moment where it already felt like you couldn't, like these jobs, being a critic wasn't a job already. Already it felt like that was slipping away, like that wasn't a real possibility or a trajectory that was accessible. If you wanted to do this kind of work, it was scrappy, and it felt perpetually scrappy, and it has been. Like 17 years later, I'm still scrappy. But I found Sky, and I found a lot of the publications that I started working with because I was looking for spaces where I could feel like the kind of work I wanted to do, which was, I wanted to do this work because I was trying to figure something out. I wanted to talk about and be engaged with art deeply. And writing for me was a way to engage in a world of experiment and creation and the possibility of ideas that I felt like the artists were also engaging with. And in this ecosystem where the publishing platforms were becoming scarcer and the pay was incredibly low, even if you were writing for a major publication for the most part, I was seeking out homes and platforms that were like-minded, and that were also trying to find alternative methods and support structures for this kind of work. And there were a number of small publications I passed through along the way, and Contemporary Art Review Los Angeles and Momus are two of those that are still doing quite well and still, I think, doing more than, actually figuring out a way to make this kind of work sustainable and to raise rates for writers, and are no longer just like, they're actually platforms that I think are offering a model for how this work can be a different kind of sustainability.
Right.
So I guess I'm talking about a crisis of sustainability and finding platforms and networks.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, because if we can see the conversation 20 years ago around crisis as being indeed sort of entrenched in an older generation of typically white men, or staff positions at newspapers and this kind of thing that we were actively tectonically shifting away from. And I think in hindsight we can identify as being growing pains rather than stopping points or breakage exactly. But where did I want to get to with that? I guess I want to understand if for instance, Jess, you were responding actively in co-founding Arts.Black in 2016, I believe it was, or 2015. We share almost the same birth year. If you were in a similar way trying to sort of produce something you saw missing in the field, and if you can speak a bit to that experience.
Absolutely. I mean, I think not unlike a moment in which, particularly in the US, in the wake of the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, 2014, 2015, the art world, and heavy emphasis on the air quotes there, was responding to what it saw as a kind of attempt of racial reconciliation, which is a very vapid phrase to begin with, right? But Arts.Black kind of emerges in response to many cultural institutions trying to do some task of reconciliation, and in that, publications were not implicated in that project. And I think what myself and my co-founder, Taylor Aldrich, really wanted to be able to assert was two things. One, that there is a lineage of Black critics who have been working, even if they have not necessarily been working under the auspices of legacy media. So the art forums or the Canadian art magazines, right? Like there that trajectory that exists. And also we knew younger art critics who were Black who were writing anyway. And we wanted to give them a container, even if in this supposed task of racial reconciliation, they weren't being invited to do that. And so Arts.Black kind of tries to be in conversation with what we consider to be a really hollow gesture that, was not unique to that moment, but is perhaps in the moment feeling very intense.
If we can zoom out with hindsight, then maybe we can understand the criticism crisis to be one that was limited to a discourse before becoming material in more recent seasons. And yet, and this is where I hope to kind of transition us into more fertile ground, because within a dismantling moment is a ton of opportunity and possibility. And never have we seen legacy art publications so distrusted as we do now, never mind that they were the first ones to freeze their budgets when the pandemic hit, and a lot of them haven't stopped. Never mind that most of them started to cut their freelancers altogether and start turning to their in-house staff. And as we can see, those are most of the bylines at some of these major publications now. So there's still this kind of churn 'em out ethic, if you can call it that, or thirst that's happening at that level that I think we are seeing the public now fully disenfranchised of. Doesn't help, of course, that there is any number of political agitation here to support boycotting and et cetera. So I just see so much opportunity here. And I think where I want to get us maybe from here is to talk about how we're seeing need show up as editors and as writers, but particularly as editors and as mentors. Maybe I can turn to you again, Jess, and we can talk a bit about, I should mention, Jess is the mentor for the Critical Writing Fellowship in its third year that we've just set in motion and named the fellows. We're thrilled. And we did see a significant volume of applications, and also from subject centers and positionalities and, as I say, places of need that I don't think we had seen articulated quite to that degree before.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I'm mindful of in this work with all of you is how it seems to me that there are many writers who understand themselves as critics who are interested in complicating formal risk on the page. And by that I mean that there is an expectation that criticism show up formally and structurally in certain ways. And I feel like in the process of thinking about what this critical writing fellowship could be this year, it felt important to me as a mentor to invite a conversation about structural and formal agitation, the things that, and the stories and the ideas that might not necessarily find legs in the 2-week to 4-week traditional editorial cycle. And I think that is also something personally I was really needing as a writer myself. Where are the outlets or the editors who will sharpen me on a level of craft and also allow me to be a big idea person and a big question person. And I think what Momus is offering is the space to dare in that way, from writers who also may not necessarily have immediate access to a pipeline, like a Rolodex of editors, or even be reading all the time legacy publications as if that is the only metric by which we can assess someone's imagination and rigor.
Yeah, I thought it was significant that in Lydia Nichols, who is the fellow this year, in her application, in that first paragraph, she was talking about, I've been doing this for 8 years and I am still emerging because I have not had the resources, the time, the anything to get beyond chasing a deadline or, as we know, a pretty measly check. And never mind that she's also a young mother. And so there's just been so much that has inflected that, not stagnancy of emergingness, but, and these categories are pretty unuseful anyways, but certainly she was very, or seems to be very aware that there is another place she could get to, if only with some space and money and someone to talk to about how the writing is going. And those are fairly profound, sort of on the Maslow pyramid of needs. Those are pretty basic and pretty crucial to the work that we're doing writ large.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, Jess, and as you mentioned Lydia in that first paragraph, I started writing for Momus in 2015, and I came to Sky with an essay. I was also 8 years in. I had been working long enough in Los Angeles and writing about the art world in Los Angeles that I was starting to have, this happens to critics all the time, I was starting to have relationships and friendships with the people I was writing about. I would write, and then we would start talking, and then they would become people who were in my life, or they wouldn't be my friends, but they would be people that because art worlds, even in major cities, are small, I would start to know things about them. Like, I was no longer writing as an outsider. Like, when I started, I was, because I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know what I was doing, but suddenly I was part of this world, and I wanted to write about that. I wanted a place that would let me look at what it meant to be in a field where I felt like nepotism had created exclusivity, that there was a long legacy of critics writing about their friends and not acknowledging it. There was a long, Clement Greenberg did it all the time. I didn't want to participate in that exclusivity, but I also wanted to keep having friends. So I brought that essay to Sky, that pitch to Sky, and I was able to work on it with the slowness and care it needed, and that established my relationship with Momus. And I kept doing that. Like, if I had a piece that needed that attention, I would bring it to Momus. And in 2020, when Sky was... It was casual. Sky was rethinking. A lot had happened at Momus. A lot had happened in the world. Sky was thinking about what Momus could do in response to the reckonings that were happening that summer of 2020 around race and violence, and the racism of the art publishing industry, and the inequality, and really reimagining the editorial team. And in that space, I casually said I would help, and I really thought that. I was like, oh, I can do a little editing for you. And at first, I just charged my friend rate, and I was thinking, I'm helping a publication and an organization that I care about. And then within a month, Sky was like, you know what, I'm going to pay you a lot more than that. And that was the first time where I thought, oh, this doesn't have to be these platforms that I want to exist it doesn't have to be sacrifice. Actually, maybe I could be supported by these things that I want to see in the world. And that's why I'm still here, is because Sky's figured out how to do that over time, is to figure out how to give us a living wage for work that's still part-time for all of us. We all do other things. But because of that, it really changes the way you start to think about what's possible when you can pay your rent.
for example.
For example. Merray, I want to, and thank you for that, Catherine. I want to get into this question of need again and maybe address your experience working with certain writers in the very recent past, like Lois Taylor Biggs, and how you're seeing, first of all, writers show up to Momus. Well, let's not be too proprietarial about, how are you seeing writers existing right now in terms of where the need is and where best we can respond, or you as an editor specifically can respond?
I think that even before Canadian art folded, even before we decided collectively to boycott the Penske publications, and people can't, in good conscience, write for Art Forum or Art News or whatever. I think even before then, my sense was always that there was a hunger for relationship and for somebody to think with and someone to like really to really get deeper than like the comments in the Google Doc or whatever. And that was a hunger that I had sensed in myself first and foremost. In the years that I was at Canadian Art, I was edited by people who would, for example, like just excise like an entire paragraph, or like just, it's like the piece has to meet this length for whatever reason, whether it was print or online, and I was getting edited by people who also wanted to sterilize me, and I very much formed myself against my editorial practice, very much against. I don't want to use violence to use the word violence in a gratuitous way, but it did often feel violent, the ways in which I found myself excised and sterilized and entirely obstructed on some occasions. And so I think because I came through this very like suffocating context, I wanted to try to imagine or to try to think about what is it that I've needed that I haven't received. And now that I'm working for and with a publication that pays me well and that values my labor and that values my ideas, and where, as much as I love print and am a print loyalist to the end, we're not making a print publication, which means that our production schedule is different. It means that we don't have like an object that needs to be produced and deadlines to meet to like make that thing happen, which I think is important to mention, because in the absence of that kind of organizing logic or organizing structure, it's actually possible, for example, in the piece with Lois, that like we were on the, we would hang out on the phone for like an hour and a half every other week, and we would talk about, she would ask me questions about like how do you have a writing practice? Like how do you actually establish a daily writing practice? And so at first my prompts to her, before we even figured out what this piece was going to be, I was like, sit with the work, like carve out a time once a day, every day for a week, and just like look at this image and write 250 words about it, and like just see what happens. Text me, like, let's, talk about it. And it was just like, not just with Lois, but with other writers I've worked with, it's always been so heartening, but also like low-key devastating for people to be like, oh my God, you're actually reading my work. Oh my God, you're like picking up the phone and like talking me through my crisis. Like, I've never received attention like this. And I've, and my answer is like, yeah, same. But we are in the process, and we have, I think have been for a long time, creating a structure within which that is possible. And I think that mentorship is really like and that's what makes doing this work so valuable and personally rewarding, very deeply personally rewarding for me.
Yeah, which I hope I'm not over-commanding, like if they're, jump in please, but I think that gets us to actually this ground around how do we learn how to do this, especially if, as you say, yeah, me neither. This hasn't happened to me either, and here we are manufacturing this experience for both of us in real time against what we've experienced in the past. And I know personally as a publisher, it was hugely informative to work for several, but crucially Blue N Art Info. Not that anybody probably remembers that, but it was a moment. And, and I ran the Canadian arm of that for 3 years, breakneck, and I had to argue to be paid every month for, sometimes weeks. So rent was perpetually late, but there was this sense of, okay, this is how you don't do it, and yet we got to something good because of essentially benign neglect and other things like that allowed me to really run that rope in the direction I wanted it to go. But all to say, what are some of the experiences for you all that have been informative, whether because you want to model yourself after them or because you're going in the opposite direction very intentionally?
I really appreciate that question, and I feel like I have two responses. So first, I think in the macro sense, I learned what it meant to be a writer in relationship to other writers because I was learning from Black women writers, particularly Black feminist writers, June Jordan, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison, and reading about the ways in which they understood relationality, like a horizontal engagement, which is a political stance, right? So for me, it was always really important that if I was going to do this work, it was a with, it was a cipher, which brings me to my next point. For a long time, I don't even think y'all know this, I really wanted to write about hip hop. I wanted to write about music. And the reason I did is because as a genre, hip hop had always had a kind of, we will make the rules as we go, but it will still be sharp and impactful and rigorous. And hip hop journalists, Greg Tate's, Dream Hampton's, Joan Morgan's, they were doing something amazing on the page that was not happening elsewhere, right? And so when I was young, before I even thought about a kind of visual arts vocabulary, I was like, these are the Black writers who are stylistically taking the chances that I want to take, who are kind of complicating what an essay can be, what it means to be in relation to an artist, right? And so I think for me, that history, which is, again, also a very kind of political position to take on the page, was deeply informative to any imagination I had of myself as a writer. And I think in the specific sense, there are editors like Jill Steinhauer, who I worked with at Hyperallergic, Claudia Larocco, who was the former editor-in-chief of Open Space, which was a magazine published by the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, right? These Danielle A. Jackson at the Oxford American, folks who took the time to talk with me, asked me really tough questions about ideas that we're formulating, and also respected this engagement as an engagement of craft too. I think the macro and the micro really gave me a certain kind of wind when I was able to kind of step into the role first at Artside Black and also now. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that maybe a different. It's so true. Like writers, there's so much like being in community with the writers you admire is so formative. But I had I guess so many bad experiences because you have to, if you're going to do this work and make a living and have writing be a significant part of that, you've got to write a lot. And that's not. I mean. Maybe sometimes I'm at a point where I've figured out a balance where I don't have to write all the time, which is amazing. But that still means like 2 pieces a month, and that's a lot of writing. But so I had so many experiences, and definitely experiences not being read, like feeling like you had to, like you learn that you've got to game the system a little bit, like you have to turn in copy that you've already realized that can't be misread, but then there's a limit to the risk taking you can take in that kind of writing, because if you're actually going to try to push into articulating ideas that are complex and difficult, for an editor who doesn't know how to read, maybe or can't read because they're being pressured to put out a quota, an absurd number of articles per week or even per day at some publications. You have to learn how to guard yourself against that in the way you write, which I think affects a lot of what we read. But I had two editors that over the years that I still keep in touch with that are, I'll follow them and continue to keep up with them for as long as I can. One was Zach Pincus Roth, who's now at the Washington Post, but he came in at the LA Weekly, and I started writing for the LA Weekly. I mean, maybe like the Village Voice, like so many of these LA Weeklies doesn't really exist anymore, but I had the experience that is so incredible for a young writer to be on that weekly beat where I had got to go out and I got to write about weird performance. I got to do those things, like cover a scene. And he was so good at being like, you think that's interesting? Why do you think that's interesting? And then helping me make it work for the general wide audience readership and the vibe of the LA Weekly. And that was amazing. Like an editor who was willing to meet you where you were and help you become what the publication needed you to be without curbing you. He let me write about the weirdest stuff, and he just I learned, we learned together. I think we've learned together, and I think that's a lot of experiences with editors is you become an editor is learning how because they also want to put out work as we all do in the world that's exciting and experimental, but they have the restrictions of the publication. And the other one is Julia Halpern at ArtNet. And ArtNet is such a crazy publication, and it has such a vibe. And she was able to bring in writers who she really respected and who wanted to write about things that were important and were investigative. And she'd let you do it. She'd let you do the work you wanted to do, and then she'd put little ArtNet style she'd figured out how to make it work for the ArtNet listicle vibe. So she'd just give it that little tweak or the sensationalistic headline or whatever so that you could publish this thing. And ArtNet also paid a little better. Not a ton, but it paid a little better. So you're okay, I'll write for Julie, and my article will come out with some crazy scandalous headline, but it will be my work. It'll be the work I want to put in the world otherwise. And those things taught me a lot. But then at Momus, we have this amazing gift, which is that we're not working for a major company. We're not owned by the New Times or some, I don't know who, a Murdoch or So there's we do have something we're trying to do. Which maybe I can't articulate right now, but that would be a group effort too. But we're actually able to take a writer's work and be okay, you want to say this, here, we can help you say it in a way that works for our audience and for us as a publication, and also hopefully for you.
Well, thank you. And how about you, Merray? In terms of how to learn how to do this against what you've experienced or because of it?
I think it was. There's so much, you see this most prominently in conversations around student loan forgiveness, right? Where a generation of people will be why should they have their loans forgiven if I've been in debt my whole life and I've always been paying it off or whatever. So there's a way to respond to having been treated like shit to also then treat people like shit because you were treated like shit and I was treated like shit. And I think something that frustrated me so deeply in my work in these institutions, which Momus decidedly is not, is that there was always this well, things are this way because they have to be this way. Yeah. And don't ask any questions. If you push, if you challenge, you become a problem, and you will be treated like a problem. And so what this does, because asking questions naturally is a threat, what this does is it creates an environment among workers where we're all trying to uphold this fucking fake thing that like human beings made. But when you ask questions like, well, why are we doing it this way? It doesn't make sense to do it this way. The answer is always like, well, we've always been doing it this way, so we have to keep doing it this way. Yeah. And what I'm gesturing towards with that was that it was suffocating because it came from, or because it indicated a lack of imagination. And I think, I mean, it was like around this time a year ago, Sky, that you asked me to join the editorial team, and for me it was such an immediate yes, because I was like, this is clearly, like, I can see from the outside that this is a place that is trying to imagine how to do things differently. And so my not answer basically is like, I think there was a dearth of models for me in the institutional spaces that I came up through. And it was really like what I mean, it was really like the force or the power of imagination that like fueled my belief that something else is possible. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be this way, actually. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, sorry to keep this to be like, Momus is so great, but Momus is so fucking great. It's just like, it feels almost like a once in a lifetime, really, to like be so deeply supported to like do this kind of work that is first and foremost, like, I mean, you can teach anybody how to copy edit, right? Like there's sentence syntax, and there are like these kind of like technical facets to editing that like you could teach anyone, but the part of the work that cannot be taught in a program or in a whatever is the relational facet of the work. Yes. You learn the relational by being in relation. Yeah.
I will say briefly that our copy editor is amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Claire Boone.
Claire Boone.
Yes.
Shout out Claire Boone.
Claire.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry, Claire. I'm not saying that anybody could do your job.
Nobody can do what Claire does.
Nobody can do Claire. No, nobody can do it. But I'm saying I'm this position I formed against this kind of like ethos that I encountered among my colleagues, that like to edit somebody is to command them. It is to assert it is to assert your power over them, because ultimately as the editor you get the final say in like what goes live or what goes in print or whatever. I'm on a listserv where like a few days ago somebody posted that Art News published their story about the situation in Germany, the like en masse silencing and threatening of Palestinians and people who are expressing and staking solidarity with Palestinians in the art world. And this writer said that Art News published their piece without running it past them. Wow. Like...
That's definitely happened to me before.
Yeah, so it's like, but then we're told that like, oh, well, just this is the way that it has to be. Like, it's just, this is how business is done. I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place here. I guess I'm just feeling this kind of frustration with like what I'm feeling in this moment, that so much is crumbling, where people are like, yeah, but what will we have, or what will we, you know? Yeah, I'm just trying to express my frustration with the lack of imagination. Really.
I will say we don't exist in a vacuum, though, and we do have sister publications, I would call them, especially in North America, but there's a few that were on the board a moment ago, I can go back, that are in places like Estonia, and I'm mentoring a young publisher in Ukraine right now, for instance. There are some incredible things happening, and they are small, but because it's such an important facet of being a strong editor and in relation to your writers, that we be reading as much as possible, I wanted to kind of gesture to who are we reading, or where else are we hoping to see some of our writers show up as a byline. And if, by the way, that doesn't feel like such a generative question, I'm also interested in the more historical critics that you continue to return to, like I think Barbara Christian.
Well, I'll say that I want to see our writers everywhere, and we do. Yeah. We do see them all over. Like, I mean, I think there's nothing proprietary about being if you're a freelancer, you got to write, and we don't, we as much as we try to pay writers as well as possible, and that's due to Sky having a commitment to raising rates whenever Momus can afford it. We still can't, we can't support a writer publish twice a year. So I mean, I'm thrilled wherever their work is, and also I think it's a really generative. I think as a writer and a reader, thinking as an editor is really helpful. It's really nice to read something amazing and think, I'm going to reach out to this writer and say, listen, if you want to write about X, or if you want to expand this idea that you footnoted here, come to us. It also, I don't believe in being competitive, and I've had to learn that over time, because it's really hard, I think, for all of us, if we work in the arts, or other fields are like this too, where it's really hard to make a living. So you start to think it's hard to make a living because there aren't enough opportunities. And so you have a tendency to hold on to your opportunities and not share them, which is wrong thinking, because that's not the problem. And so I've had to learn to not think that way, to not think that because somebody else is a byline and at a publication where I've just cultivated a relationship with an editor, that they're my competition, because they're not. There is room for all of us, and that's not the problem. The problem is much bigger and more systemic than that. But I think that reading as an editor helps me get out of that mindset even more, because I can think I'm like, I want to help this person's ideas reach more people, or I want to help them do something that could be so exciting, and having a platform to invite them to do that is really helpful.
Yeah, I really appreciate the kind of assertion and declaration that we're in community. This is a rhizomatic effort, I couldn't have said that better myself. I think specifically I'm reading places like Protean Magazine, which is an amazing kind of leftist cultural publication. They've been doing some amazing work recently as it relates specifically to writing about and supporting Palestinian authors. I'm from the American South, so I'm reading Burn Away, which is a great publication that's covering the South as an important nexus and site. I feel like those are two, or maybe also I will shout out Jupiter Magazine, founded by Camille Bacon and Daria Simone Harper, which has just released issue 2 of their publication. But Camille was a Momus emerging critic resident, and so again, the kind of rhizome feel is here.
Yeah, we've actually got a quote from Camille on the screen now, reflecting on the residency that Jess led in the summer of 2022, that I think in no small part influenced her thinking around launching a publication, which is meaningful to draw those connections to mentorship, but also peer network building, which I see these mentorship opportunities doing. And sorry, I had a stray thought that was, oh yes, and also we have a writer in LA that you're close with, I think, Alison Noel Connor, who has talked about similarly that residency you ran, Jess, having such a kind of window pushing open effect for her thinking around editing being also something that she could engage with and have as a lifeline alongside her writing practice, and that one didn't have to compete with or make redundant the other. And I think that's so crucial, right? That not only we don't stay too narrow or myopic about the opportunities we're offering people, that we don't stay proprietary over our writers and our bylines and our editors, but also that we recognize that constellating is happening across these mentorship opportunities, if only because suddenly, as we were starting out with, talking about this symposium in 2015 being a launching ground for some of these relationships on this stage, if that doesn't happen, then it doesn't, you know what I mean? If we don't sort of infrastructure some of these moments for meeting one another in this space around these objectives and desires, then we continue to, I think, be touched by scarcity mentality because we don't realize how many others are out there, right?
I will say I'm working with Allison and Aaron O'Leary right now at Contemporary Art Review Los Angeles, filling in for Lindsay Preston Zappis, who's on maternity leave, as the editor-in-chief there for this quarter. And it's amazing. Like, it's, again, we're not an island. Like, it's fantastic to work with Aaron and Allison, and there's a care. Working with them has also reminded me of the kind of, what we're talking about when we're talking about editorial care is like how you phrase an email to a writer, like the ways in which you pose questions, the language that you're using, which suggests in its framing that you're caring for this writer's work. You want it to be its best self out in the world, and that's so it was like, you know, in taking on this extra role of editing Carla, where it was too much and I was exhausted, but I was seeing these emails come through from Aaron and Allison to the writers we'd commissioned, and just seeing the care and attention they were bringing. I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, it is. I am so fortunate to have multiple places where I'm working with writers and editors who are giving this kind of attention and have this ethic.
Yeah. Are there any dropped threads or things that any of you all wanted to touch on before we turn to the audience? You feeling good? Okay. And God knows that questions from the audience might spark some drop threads to be pulled up after all. But it'd be nice to open this up at this point, I think. And before I do, I've been remiss in mentioning our sponsor for this talk is Art Speak. So I just want a brief moment, but a profound moment of thanks for that support, because we do not benefit from government funding. We are doing all of this by hook or by crook, and patronage on that level can make something like this be material in a way that otherwise it would not be. So thank you very much, Art Speaks. And now I'd love to hear from the room, and if there are questions, maybe we can pass around a mic.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, I mean, somewhat personal note, how you guys protect yourself against or deal with burnout.
That's such a hard question. I like a daily. I always trying to figure it out.
I think in our working relationship, a thing that has really helped me, which is a testament to, I think, the beautiful collaboration and friendship that is this, is that I can say, I think I'm drowning, and one of you will say, then like put it down and like walk away from it. So much of the relationship I have to burnout has been a relationship of silence and shame, and I think this environment has really freed me up to be vulnerable about that, and for someone else to be like, all right, girl, then don't do it right now. You know, like it's that simple. And that has been a pivot and a kind of intervention, feeling encouraged enough to be truthful about capacity and knowing that it wouldn't be returned back as a marker of my adequacy. Yeah.
I think there's something to be said for the body's role in the work that we do. One of the very common misconceptions about this work that I've encountered over the years is that like the work of the intellect is cerebral and therefore not somatic, and I learned the hard way how fucking false that is in my mid-20s, in a way that, like, you know, my body like asserted its needs, which I had been ignoring for a long time, and then it forced me to listen. It staged a protest and it made me listen, and ever since I've kind of it's my body's developed this kind of like warning system, and so like I can tell when a migraine is like on the horizon, and I can just be like, oh, boop, boop, there's like a little bit of, I have to, and because I've worked in places before where to say that I am sick or that I am suffering was received with this kind of like, yeah, but what about the deadline? What about this magazine that we're making? I'll echo Jess again to say that I feel very lucky to be among people who are like, take care of yourself first. And I think, but absent that, I think it's just like really important to advocate for ourselves in whatever ways we're able. I mean, that maybe sounds a little cliche, but yeah, I think it's like recovering from burnout is like so hard, and it takes so much time, and so it's actually like, I don't know. This is a whole conversation. I'd be happy to talk after. Yeah. But it's. I think if we. I don't know how to. Yeah, there's so many cliches that my mind is going through. I'm just gonna sign off on that.
Yeah, sure. I was watching an episode of Abbott Elementary recently where a really good line around burnout was issued by one of the teachers, where it was asked of her by a younger, more emerging faculty member, how do you ward off burnout? And she goes, I care too much to allow for its possibility. I care too much about this work, rather, to allow for the possibility. So that means signing off at 6 and doing yoga with my mom every other day and taking weekends seriously and all those things and cooking well, and you know what I mean? But it's because I want this light to glow well and for a long time. It's in preservation of the work that you stop work. Yeah, Amelia.
Thank you all for speaking about editorial care. I don't know if that I've heard it articulated so nicely from each of you in different ways, but I'm wondering about it in a practical sense, like sort of how to do it myself or for others here. Because when it comes to print and there's this time constraints and things like this, like, does it really just involve taking as much time as you can with a writer, meeting, talking, texting? Like, is that really how you go about it? Because people do feel that the Google comments are so violent, and besides like trying to have one meeting at least, if you can slip it in where you assure them that that's not the intention and that you are, like how to do this editorial care and communicate to a writer that you're trying to do the best for their writing and make it shine and their voice shine.
Yeah, I do think like that's something that I've been working on. I'm still learning how to do it. But I've really tried to learn how to phrase comments, like to learn how to phrase them so that they're generative rather than critical. Like, I never say something's unclear. I say, I think this would be clear if, or consider X, or I'm wondering if you mean X, and if you tweak this, the problem is at first it's slow. Like, it's a slow learning curve to learn how to do that, so it's efficient for you as the editor, and it has taken me a little while to get there. But now I kind of have a toolbox where I can phrase those comments proactively. But in terms of print, I think setting expectations with a writer, like right at the beginning, like this is what you can expect from the editorial process, and like setting them, suggesting it could be more than it actually would be. Like with a writer, that when everything goes great, it goes great. But from the front, say, okay, it could be 2 really intense edits at the top end, and we need to get this finalized by X date. So, like, I think that setting those expectations helps so that you don't end up in a process. Because I think that's something that I've also learned through failing at it, is that sometimes when you don't set those expectations and an edit's really hard and you pull a writer through, you're paying them $400, say, and you push them through weeks and like these grueling weeks, it starts to feel hopeless, especially if you're doing it at 2 a.m. because you have a day job or you have to write 4 other things that week or whatever. Like, I think setting those expectations has helped me feel like I'm not I don't, abusing is the wrong word, but I'm not pushing the writer through something that's unfair.
I think it's also like a matter of like that you're asking this question tells me that you're inclined to think about how to cultivate a relationship founded in care, which is something that it's intentional, it's not incidental, right? Like you have to be like thinking about this thing that Catherine just said of like, okay, like how do I put this in a way that is coming from kindness and care rather than like, you know, I'm your editor and, you know, you'll do what I want or whatever, you know? But I think it's also like if you're a writer yourself, it becomes easier to think about like, well, how if I was on the receiving end of this, how would I want my editor to tell me that I'm gonna have to like take this back to the drawing board and like start over?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it gets to some of what we've already talked about, which is we are learning how to do this from being ourselves writers, sometimes mishandled, sometimes neglected, and rarely but profoundly treated the way that we would hope to model our own editorial work after, which is crucial. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have maybe two naive questions. First of all would be, is there a reason why you're not government funded? And where do you find your funding? And the second question is, I feel like the tradition and culture of art writing in English Canada is different than in French Canada. And I wonder if you've ever thought about translating your articles.
Yeah. Well, to the funding question, I think the Canada Council is catching up to us. I've been told this by a few officers around international, for instance, you know, the fact that we're focused on an international readership and contributor base has been a sticking point for a Canadian government that is dead set on things being made for and by Canadians. Also being online was pretty confusing to them for a long time. And things like this. So we've been struggling to, but I think also, and we can get into the weeds too easily on this, so I'll have to guard myself, but the way the CCA funds things is you need to grow your branches as long and spindly as possible and drape ornaments on them endlessly, and then you get to have a trunk. Right? Like, you know, core funding only becomes available if for 5 years you are successful with projects. And projects will kill the base of what you're doing if you're not thoughtful about your energy, about your capacity, everything we've just been addressing. So it's been rascally. But luckily we have fiscal sponsorship in the States, which effectively gives us charitable status, and that is opening a load of new doors for us in terms of foundation support in the US. And I figure, hey, we'll just go where the reciprocity is showing up in terms of funding. And to your second question, yes, although I can worry that French becomes a very specific choice around, you know, if we're going to be translating, why start there? And if we're going to be translating, why not then, you know, touch on other languages as quickly as possible? And that starts to feel overwhelming. And yeah, I do worry a bit about the kind of provincialism that could potentially denote in terms of the Canadian, you know, the Canadian question at the center of that kind of action. But it's a good question, and it comes up a lot. Yeah.
Hey, thanks so much to all of you. I really enjoyed that talk so much. I really like the way that you're talking about how to think about a sustainable future for writing through talking about writing practice and editing practice and relationality. But I'm also kind of wondering if any of you could speak to, like, in terms of, I think you were also all talking a lot about sort of like the material conditions of the field and how terrible they are and like how to address that. But in the face of like all of the tectonic shifts that are happening and have been happening in the field over the last few years, I wonder if any of you can speak to some germ of like imagination or some sort of leading to a different future that actually comes from art practice itself? Like, are you seeing developments in the kind of art practice that you're seeing and writing about that are leading writing in a new direction?
That's a good question. It's a thoughtful question. I'm not sure this answers it quite, but it reminds me of something we were discussing in anticipation of this, which was that at the center of our work, we love artists, and that everything redounds to that. And I think that piece can be detached when we're talking about criticism sometimes. We can forget that this is not antagonizing work. It's in fact, it's roped with love and desire and care. But I don't think that's the question. Yeah.
I feel like your question makes me think a lot about the practice of the artist Chloe Bass. Chloe Bass considers herself to be a conceptual artist who works in a performance mode, but not necessarily creating performances for audiences. But the central question that she's always chasing is the question about intimacy at various scales, whether that be the level of the municipality, as in a project that she worked on in St. Louis and Ferguson in the wake of the death of Michael Brown, whether that be at the scale of the family, as in a project that she was thinking about intimacy across and within biracial families in the US, and whether that be at the relationship between artist and critic, as in a lecture performance series that she does, in which she invites writers and thinkers to kind of respond in real time to a series of images. We share those images, and you don't know what the other has selected, but you're kind of talking through them in real time. And the reason I think of her when I think of your question is that for me, intimacy is deeply connected to possibilities about interventions in material conditions. And of course, it doesn't mean that there's this overnight change in how liquid we all are, right? But when I think about Chloe's work and when I think about this question that she poses, the question of intimacy, how it functions, how it shows up, how we can offer it to one another, I think there's a call to action and a position of generosity. And that may feel naive. I may sound naive saying that, but I think it goes back to a refusal in the myth of scarcity, that somewhere out there, there's already enough for all of us. And I think her practice really kind of draws that out, in that it's focusing its attention on the kind of interpersonal and on the relational, and how that could be messy or muddled in public, and yet nothing is quite disposable, right? So I think of her at the level of practice, and I hope that that feels aligned with your question. But
I like that as an answer. Sure.
oh, okay.
Thanks.
I also wanted to add, hi, it's so nice to see you in person. That we've, not just us, but other publications too. Like some of them, artists writing about what's happening right now. Some of the most powerful pieces we've published have been by artists thinking about art, other artists, but also doing some big picture thinking about what's happening right now. Elizabeth Nikula's pieces, I think, at Momus. I just edited a text by the artist Maya Garantz, who was just looking at, she was just reflecting on one of her own projects, but the essay became so multifaceted. And I think that again, that this is an antagonistic relationship, that artists are writing and articulating worldviews and alternatives in text. And
it feels in one way that the question is a little too soon to answer. Like I look around me and I feel like for the past 7 months the matrices have been shifting, and I think will continue to shift for a long time. And I think a lot of artists and writers and cultural workers have been asking themselves what we can do to stop a war. And Yeah, I mean that's a whole other conversation. But to bring it back briefly to your question, I found myself very excited by the work of Writers Against the War on Gaza and the incredible organizing that they've been doing for the past 7 months. I was very lucky to just happen to be at a protest in New York, and WAWOG had organized like a kind of like a split protest that marched to the headquarters of the New York Times, where they distributed the first newspaper that they started making at the time in their New York Crimes series, and witnessing that work evolve over the months, and like reaching more people, witnessing more people becoming participants in those actions has for me been very heartening, and I think the question of like, how much time do we have? Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just to say that it's and I'm seeing artists outside of. I mean, this is like a very specific group that is organizing under a banner, but over the past number of months, I've seen artists in my circles everywhere doing whatever they can do as contained and as frustrating and limited or limiting as that can feel in times, and that's been renewing my faith.
Thank you.
That might be a good place to leave it. Thank you for your audience tonight. It's been wonderful. And thank you all three for coming here
Thank you.
to
Thank
talk
you.
about this. No small effort have been made. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.